So, where should you go for cloud computing advice? The answer may surprise you. Let's talk about it. So, welcome back to the Cloud Computing Insider. This channel explores the ins and outs of cloud computing without an agenda or following into the narrative set by big tech marketing. We look at what works, what does not, and the actual value of this technology in a balanced and information-forward way. If that interests you, please subscribe, like, and comment. I'm your host, David Linthicum, author, speaker, B-List Geek. Let's get started. So this topic came from a bunch of questions I'm getting nowadays in terms of where people are getting their advice from, and also the fact that in doing a triage on a lot of these bad and failed cloud computing projects, migration projects, net new development, things like that, the genesis of where they went off the rails was taking bad advice from somebody, consulting companies, influencers, things like that. And so I figured I'd spend a video looking at who we should listen to in the industry right now as far as where cloud computing advice is coming from and how to take that advice and some of the pros and cons of each of these sources. And since I played most of these roles, I think I'm uniquely qualified to provide a perspective. So let's get into it. So those providing cloud advice, the landscape out there is noisy and complex. Everybody's trying to influence things, and there's a lot of information is pretty much free. Producing information is pretty much free. So lots of stuff out there we can choose from. Some of it bad, some of it good, and it's hard to dissect the good from the bad. And again, this can lead to you making wrong choices and bad decisions based on this bad advice. A lot of triage when I try to figure out what happened here, why'd you do this? They'll tell me that 10 years ago they heard from the consulting company, or they heard from their vendor, or they heard from a colleague that this was something they should look into. And so let's just kind of cut through the BS and look at what you should and shouldn't, who you should and shouldn't trust out there, and the pros and cons of each source. So the first would be cloud influencers, and you could say cloud influencers and thought leaders. Used to be called thought leaders, now they're called influencers. It doesn't matter, but people out there who have a perspective on cloud computing, and they have blogs, they have podcasts, they have YouTube channels like me, and trying to disseminate some pragmatic advice and then trying to get people who listen to it. And obviously the benefit for them is that people hire them as consultants, influencers, speaking events, things like that, which is kind of why I'm doing this. So often the pros are often this is hands-on experience. In other words, I have 30 years in this business, I can tell you, and I've touched everything. Haven't done everything, but I can kind of give you an idea of what this technology means, how it works, and more importantly, how it doesn't work. So looking at the good, bad, and the ugly of each of these sides. And so normally that's going to be fairly reliable because you're listening to their experience. And if their experience sounds credible, then someone you should listen to. Usually more current than traditional sources. In other words, focusing on what's cool, where things are going, and talking about the pragmatic use of technology like we do here. And normally speak plainly about real world challenges, which as influencers is kind of a must. In other words, you have to have pragmatic advice and provide them with your take on it, and so they can make their own decisions. There's some cons, however, maybe pushing vendor agendas. I do some vendor sponsored videos here. Certainly for social media, things like that. Those are clearly marked, but it is going to be not that there's no bias. There is a bias because someone's paying me to do that, and you have to kind of consider that. Normally, it doesn't affect the opinions that I provide, and my clients know that, but it can for others, and you have to consider it in the advice you're getting. Quality varies dramatically. People are all over the place in the knowledge and their expertise. Limited enterprise scale experience normally with a lot of these influencers, and it's very true. Often chasing trends rather than substance, and yeah, I have to remember I'm doing these videos and doing podcasts and writing blogs and doing social media posts to get listened to get hits. So often influencers are talking about what everybody else is talking about, what's trendy, what's hot. Obviously AI these days, cloud security, things like that. And so they kind of, put a finger up in the wind, figure out where things are blowing, and that's normally where their content comes from. And that's okay, but you have to consider that's a motivating factor as well. So if you're looking at something that may be more along the lines with traditional technology, they're not talking about it. Normally that's why. Next would be the cloud TechPress, TechPress in general. Magazines, everything's online now. Used to be we went to the newsstand and we got, PC Magazine, Information Week. That's not the case these days. Hundreds of different TechPress magazines out there, all varying different degrees of quality. And you have to kind of look and pick and choose which ones are going to provide you the substance that you need to take the advice from. So broad coverage of industry and developments, because normally they have reporters and journalists that are paid to do that. Not that many as it was 20 years ago, but they do have them now. Quick access to breaking news. In other words, they're going to be all over something, as it's released because they're paid to do that. And there's some deep technical analysis. I like to think that on InfoWorld and some of the deeper content things, I provide deeper content than just flybys or reprinting press releases, which is what a lot of the tech press does. And you can find some really good stuff there and continue to do so. However, the cons would be often vendor-driven content. You got to remember they work on advertising, and so they're paid for by big enterprise players, big cloud providers, and so you'll find that their advice tends to run in favor of those of who's paying them. Clickbait, tendency. They're working on clicks these days. That's how they get paid. So they're going to put a lot of very overhyped ways of doing it, and it's done here on YouTube as well. They're all playing the clickbait game. Lack of real-world implementation experience. Normally, when you're dealing with a journalist, you're not dealing with somebody who is an architect. It's just someone who's following the space, and sometimes sacrifices accuracy for speed. So in other words, they'll move through an article, get something done in about 30 minutes, not worry about how accurate it's going to be, and just to get it out there because they're trying to get the clicks, trying to get the money in. So what about the professional advice givers? Big consulting would be one of those. Obviously, the big consulting firms out there all over cloud computing. Everybody has a cloud practice out there. You're dealing with the boutique firms, normally under 200 people, and then the mid-sized firms, there are not too many of them out there, and the large, mega huge cloud consulting firms out there, many of them out there at 150 years old. And they're derivatives of their accounting practice, and everybody's out there providing advice, and they want to be the advisors for you, and that's in essence why you hire consultants. But I think we have to kind of consider the quality of advice we're getting from those folks. So normally they have deep enterprise expertise. In other words, they're working on a lot of different problem domains. When I was working for consultants, for consulting firms, some that I own, some that I just worked on a variety of different projects, and therefore had lots of experience I could take into other projects, and even doing that today. In other words, working across different clients that are hiring me to do their architecture. I can take those experiences and bring them to other problem domains. Not their IP, but just the experience. Broad technology exposure. They know most of the cloud providers out there and most of the enterprise providers out there. Strong methodology and frameworks. In other words, they focus on productizing processes to get you into the cloud or get you into AI, things like that. And there's certainly a lot of resource depth. They have people around who just focus on a particular topic, and they're really good at that particular topic. Whether it's IoT, serverless computing, public cloud providers, private cloud providers, AI-based systems, things like that. You can find somebody in the firm that's going to have a lot more expertise than you have that's able to provide some pretty good advice. So keep that in mind. However, the cons would be normally it's expensive. It's very expensive. So if you're using a consultant, you're paying as much as $1,000 an hour for many of these deep expertise. They do this trick where they show up with some very good people who are kicking off the project, but they may end up leaving lots of younger, less experienced people around to finish the thing up. This is bait and switch now. It's just kind of how they work because those people who are showing up who have the best expertise are very expensive, and they're trying to get them off and working on other projects so they can make their firm profitable. And they're often pushing specific vendor relationships. This is the big one for me because, if you look at AWS reInvent last week, there was a bunch of Partners of the Year awards with different consulting organizations. And if I'm going to a consulting firm, I'm considering them to be a objective third party, a trusted advisor. And many times they have these very deep, chummy relationships with these big technology providers. And so much so that you get on projects sometimes and they'll invite in the vendors even before they know if the vendors are needed. And so that's troublesome to me, and that seems to be increasing as people are looking to monetize and drive more profitable projects and trying to drive these partnerships where they're dragging some technology provider in based on an existing relationship, and that may or may not be the right solution. In fact, when we looked at some of the repatriation issues and people who are fixing mistakes that they made 10 years ago, 9 times out of 10, it's bad advice they got from a consulting partner where they basically led the project around a particular cloud provider, AWS, Microsoft, Google, or somebody else. And that ended up being the wrong choice for everything they were looking for it to do. It worked, but again, it was very under-optimized for what they're looking to do. So this can be a problem. So I would consider the relationships that they have with the other vendors and be very wary about them if they're bringing vendors into the projects before they know exactly what they're doing yet. In other words, it becomes kind of a technology sales project, which it never should be. You're buying advice there. These are very expensive people, and they should provide you with objective advice before you start picking the technology. And if you don't do that, you'll end up with something that's very under-optimized and something you'll have to swap out 5 years, 10 years later, which is what a lot of enterprises are doing right now. We covered the Geico problem domain last week. They can be slow to adapt to new approaches. They have a tendency to kind of focus on their IP, and they don't really kind of come off it. So as things change, serverless, IoT, some of the AI stuff, the adaptation into the new approaches and how to do it can be a bit dragging. So in other words, it's tough to get them to pivot as much as, say, the smaller consulting firms or the influencers that are able to provide you advice because they're a little bit more up to date on what the current zeitgeist is in the particular tech industry, in this case, cloud. And let's talk about the analyst firms, particularly the ones that focus on cloud computing. A bunch of them are out there, dozens and dozens and dozens. Certainly, Gartner and IDG and, other folks out there that sell analyst services. So they sell reports, they sell analysis in particular technical sectors, networking, cloud computing, serverless computing, things like that. And there's some good and bad aspects of using them as well. Research-backed insights normally, so they're basing their research on lots of data that they collect. Enterprise perspective, in other words, they come at it from selling their analyst service to the enterprise, and so they're advocates for the enterprise typically, but sometimes advocates for the vendors as well. They should be vendor neutral, theoretically. I'm not finding that's the case all the time because you got to remember the vendors are paying them as well. And they get a good big picture view. So you get those, Gartner Magic Quadrants and all of the rankings of the different vendors out there. And it's pretty easy to pick, well, that one's up and to the right. So I'm going to go ahead and pick that company. In some cases, that may be the right move to do. But in many cases, you're going to find that's kind of a pay to play. The vendors that are able to spend the most on analyst relationships and marketing are the ones that typically, get the higher rankings. Not all the time, and I'm not talking about a particular analyst firm. I'm talking about in general, you're going to see that behavior. So in many cases, when people are taking advice from an analyst firm and they consider it well-researched and something to use, and they'll, show it to their board and show it to a lot of the decision makers, and it turns out being the wrong advice. So cons can be behind current trends. It takes them a while to catch up with certain things. In other words, we're shifting over, the shift to generative AI took a while before the research firms kind of caught up with that. Limited hands-on experience. Normally, they don't have architects, people who build stuff who are part of the analyst firms. Sometimes they do. Many times they don't. And so they're not going to have the pragmatic, real-world advice I think you need with people with hands-on experience and how they build and deploy stuff. And the pay-to-play concern, as I mentioned earlier. So in other words, they have a tendency they take money from everybody. And obviously, if they're taking money from somebody, then there's going to be a bit of a conflict there. And so in other words, if they're promoting a particular technology, it's getting ranked high. Is that because they're paying more money than the other vendors? Or is that because they actually earned it? And you have to raise those concerns and you have to ask some of the questions. It doesn't mean they're doing that all the time, but that means that would be a concern were I taking advice from those organizations. And also sometimes they can be too conservative. In other words, they're not as aggressive in understanding where the technology is going. They may tell you to tamper stuff down, slow down your movement, slow your roll to AI, things like that, when that may not be the right advice for you. So keep that in mind. So what about listening to colleagues, people you work with? I think that should be on the list of advisors as well. And the pros would be they have real world battle scars working at the company that you're working with. So they understand the political infrastructure, who to talk to, how to get things done. They can tell you in a no nonsense way how to move projects forward and how to get money allocated, get budget allocated, things like that. And so very useful in doing that. So always make friends when you work for a large company and work with your colleagues, because sometimes they're going to give you bad advice and good advice, but it's always good to have those relationships. No hidden agendas typically. In other words, they're not taking money from vendors, things like this. I hope they're not. They understand your context and the culture in the company, and they're able to provide practical advice. So, hey, Jim, hey, Sally, how do we get this thing done? How do I move this project forward? What are the steps I need to take to get the budget allocated for this? And those are invaluable if you're trying to get something done in a big company where they have set procedures and practices that they always follow. Cons would be limited exposure to alternatives. Since they're just working with the technology that enterprise picked, they don't have exposure to other cloud providers, other technology stacks, things like that. Certainly not like the analysts or the TechPress or the influencers that are out there. They're stuck in a comfort zone sometimes. In other words, they're just going down a technical path that they feel is going to be safe for them. So they're buying the same vendor, regardless of whether or not that vendor is the right optimized solution for them. And they could be perpetuating bad practices. In other words, they may be doing something wrong now, and they continue to do stuff wrong because, again, it's their comfort zone. And they might lack a strategic perspective. In other words, they understand how the technology works, in this case, cloud technology works, in their particular problem domain, within their culture, within that organization, but they don't understand how to put together a strategy, more holistic thing in terms of where things are going over the next 5 to 10 years, and how a technology configuration should be matured within that strategy. And I think that's important and often less understood. So finally, cloud technology providers. So public cloud providers, third-party cloud providers, all shapes and forms, whether they're providing middleware, security, management, FinOps, storage, compute, bunch of folks out there. Multi-trillions of dollars of money are spent in that space now. So should you listen to them? And there's an interesting take on that. So obviously they have deep technical knowledge about their stuff. So don't let them explain their competitors' stuff, because they're not going to know a lot about that, because their competitors aren't going to take them through their technology as deep as they need to be. But they do know about their stuff and where it should work and where it shouldn't work. And by the way, they should tell you both sides when this technology is going to be effective and when it's not going to be effective, when you should use it and when you shouldn't. That should be the discussion you have with them. If it's superlatives, always works, it's always the optimal solution, like he gets from some of these cloud providers out there, be very suspicious about the other information that comes out of their mouth. Direct access to roadmaps, in other words, where the technology is going, which is invaluable if you're doing a strategy. You're trying to figure out how their technology is going to mature and how your strategy is going to align with the roadmap. Strong support resources. They're able to get at people who are able to solve your issues with their technology stack, and they have the latest capabilities. In other words, they're up to date on what's cool in the cloud computing world, the serverless stuff, the AI stuff, things like that. They can tell you how their technology aligns with that. Cons would be they're always selling something. You got to remember, these folks are compensated on their ability to push technology out the door, whether either they're selling it as a service or selling licenses. So they're always going to have that motivation in the back of their minds, and that should be something you consider if you're taking advice from them. Biased against competitors, so they're always going to knock the competitors, and that would be a concern as well. Normally, they should know what their competitors are doing, where their competitors work, and where they don't, and vice versa, and be able to give you a balanced advice in that. Like, for example, when I was a product CTO, I used to make the sales guys nervous or with me, because I would tell them where my technology works, where it doesn't, and even when they should use my competitor's technology, because what the competitor offers would be better based on their use cases. They may push unnecessary complexity, additional products on top of it. So they're selling a complete stack. So you may need a stack of 3 products to solve an issue. They're trying to sell you 10. And that's because they get money and compensated for that. And typically you're not going to need that much technology. It just adds complexity and things you have to operate, things like that. And there's a lock-in agenda. So in other words, they're trying to get you in their technology because they know that in many cases, you're going to be walking down the aisle with that database, with that storage system, with that compute system. If you're binding yourself to their proprietary interfaces, proprietary systems, and so they're going to lock you in for a long time. There's enterprise technology companies that have been in enterprises for the last 20 years because they can't get rid of them because they're locked into the technology. So they're paying these exorbitant license fees. In this case, cloud providers, you're paying cloud service fees, the usage fees, and that's not necessarily going to be good. So always keep an eye out for that if you're getting advice from cloud tech providers. So bottom line for us, Dave, what does all mean? Well, you build a diverse advisory ecosystem based on weighing the pros and cons that I just talked about with the influencers, the tech providers, the analysts, big consulting firms, everything I mentioned. And understand the biases, and it's okay to listen to all opinions as long as you understand why they're giving you those opinions and balance that with some of the biases that you perceive them to have. It's never a good idea to make all your decisions around advice from a single source. And I can be a single source myself. Don't listen to influencers with everything they're advising you to do, especially if they don't understand your particular situation. When I provide advice here on this show, I'm talking about general advice. I don't know about your current situation, and if I look at your problem domain, which you can hire me to do, I can give you specific solutions that are going to be tailor-made for your particular situation, your optimized architecture. In many cases, if they're providing general advice, they're not seeing that. Obviously, consulting firms and some of the tech providers are going to have a little bit more better knowledge of your particular problem domain. They should be able to give you better advice, but again, make sure you offset that with the perceived biases and perhaps real biases that they may have. Trust but verify. Never take anybody's advice without doing some additional research, including mine, to make sure it's going to work specifically for you. Look for a pattern matching across sources. In other words, your ability to see the same advice across different sources of advice. In other words, if the influencer is saying one thing and the tech press is saying another thing and saying the same thing, and the consulting firms are saying the same thing, likely there's a wisdom of the crowd, so to speak, and people are coming to an agreement pattern across these various areas, and you may consider that as something that's going to be a bit more credible than if someone's just giving you random advice. So remember, your context and the way you look at technology is unique to you. That's why architects exist, because they work with a particular problem domain to configure the right technology to solve the problems that the enterprise has. And so if they don't have that context, they're normally not going to give you exact advice that you need, even if they're a consulting firm. They still don't work there at your company. And so you just have to consider all this sort of stuff. And the fact of the matter is it's very complex, very risky if you're taking advice these days because of everything we just talked about. So just be wary. Doesn't mean you have to be scared to get advice from other people. You certainly have to take advice to figure out where you're going, and it's a great way to learn, but also consider the source. That's all I have for this week. This is the last show of the year. Hope everybody has a great holiday. I'll see you after the first of the year and start posting videos again. Don't forget to like, subscribe, also comment below. Also, don't forget to check out my InfoWorld blog. I've been doing that for 12 years, like I mentioned. Also, my LinkedIn learning courses. I'm posting about two new every month. AI, generative AI, cloud architecture stuff. Love doing that. And also my course out on GoCloudCareers, fully mentored generative AI course. Been doing that almost for a year. So join us out there if you're interested in getting into generative AI architecture as a career path. Obviously, that's going to be very lucrative for many individuals. So until next time, you guys be very safe. Have a great holiday. I'll talk to you after the first of the year. Cheers. Bye.